Okay, we're continuing our study in the book of Nahum. If you'd like to turn, please, to Nahum chapter 3, the last chapter of the book of Nahum. As we continue our studies, we have shown the theme of the book relates to the fall of Nineveh. It's really a prophecy against the Assyrians and the capital city of Assyria, which was Nineveh. The first chapter described God's character, showing why God would punish Nineveh because of his character. His character required that he dealt with the evils of this empire. The second chapter we've studied talked about the description of their fall, the siege and so forth. And the last chapter we studied this evening, or today, will relate to the reasons that God was required to do this. So as we look at chapter 2 by way of review, what are some things he said in chapter 2 about the fall of Nineveh? How did he describe the things that happened in chapter 2? What happened to the city of Nineveh? Frank?
There would be total desolation, that their enemies would come and destroy the city that they didn't think could happen. Okay,
so it talked about the fact that the people of Nineveh thought that their city was incapable of being destroyed, but no enemy could possibly take care of and bring a defeat upon them. But God says it's going to happen because he's determined for it to happen. Okay, what else do you see in chapter 2 about the fall of Nineveh? Anything else? Karen?
They would try to flee away, but they would be taken captive.
All right, they would attempt to escape. They thought they could avoid the problems, but God says they cannot avoid them. Describes the fact that they had spoiled other nations, but now they were the ones who were going to be punished. That God had turned the tables, as we might say, and they're going to be punished like they had defeated other people. Okay? So we talked then about the fact that they would be besieged, they would be defeated, they would desert, the people would desert the city, they would be spoiled, and in the end, there would be complete annihilation. Other comments on chapter 2, anyone? All right, let's look at chapter 3 then today. Let's go ahead and read a good part of the chapter. Chapter 3, let's start in verse 1, and we'll read through, let's just go through verse 7 to start with. I'd like to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 for us, please. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Steve, please.
Woe to the bloody city. It is all full of lies and robbery. Its victim never departs. The noise of a whip, and the noise of rattling wheels, and galloping horses, battering chariots. Horsemen charged with bright sword, glittering spear. There is a multitude of slain, a great number of bodies, countless corpses. They stumble over the corpses. Because of the multitude harlotries of the seductive harlot, a mistress of sorceries, who sells nations to her harlotries and families to her sorceries. Behold, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts. I will lift your skirts over your face. I will show the nations your nakedness and the kingdoms your shame. I will cast abominable filth upon you, make you vile, and make you a spectacle. It shall come to pass that all who look upon you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is laid to waste. Who will bemoan her? Where shall I seek comforters for you?
Okay, so it begins in verse 1 of the chapter describing the reasons for the punishment that God was going to bring upon them. Verse 1, what reason does he give? What's the reason he gives in the first verse? Why the nation had to fall? Karen?
Because of a bloody city, and they were full of lies and robbery.
Bloody city full of lies and robbery. Okay? Comments? We have a city that was known for violence. The army was known for its violence and for the harm done to the people that they would attack. Other comments? Frank?
It seems that they were an enemy to all nations around them because it says that there's no end to their prey.
Okay, so they were continually defeating other nations around them. In Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 15, Zephaniah says regarding Nineveh, this is the exalted city this exalted city which dwells securely, who says in her heart, I am and there is no one besides me. How she has become a desolation, a resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. So they were known for their evils and their mistreatment of others. Here's a quotation that describes the violence of this empire. The city in the Assyrian Empire had a well-earned reputation for being bloody. Just a casual glance at the reliefs from the palaces of Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal shows the gory and blood-curdling history as we know it. There are reliefs with people being impaled, decapitated, flayed, tongues pulled out. Other reliefs show the Assyrians making people grind the bones of their dead ancestors, and even vultures plucking out the eyes of the dead. The Archaeology Study Bible says Assyrian annals describe how the heads of enemies would be heaped into large pyramids. The Assyrians often impaled enemy corpses on stakes as well. So it's one thing to defeat your enemies. It's another thing to be so incredibly vicious and cruel. So Nineveh was known for being bloody, for taking from other nations. Okay, and he's going to describe more as we go along. Other comments or questions, discussions on verse 1. All right, so in the first place, the city will fall because of the way she treats other nations. Okay, then verse 2, once again, as back in chapter 2, describes the enemy, Babylon, and how they would attack. What are some things we learn about it in verse 2? Question number 2. Well, I guess it's question number 3 and so on. How does it describe the attack of the enemy in verse 2 and 3? Terry.
Well, it talks about the horses charging through the streets and the rumbling of chariot wheels going back and forth and flashing swords and flying back and forth like lightning, and the fact that it will be tumultuous when the enemy breaks into the city. There will not be any place to go. Every place is going to be overwhelmed.
Okay, so it's much like it was in chapter 2, describing very vividly. Nahum describes the coming of the enemy, the noise of the whip as the charioteers whip their horses to go faster, and the rattling wheels of the chariots, galloping horses, and horsemen charging with bright sword and glittering spear, a multitude of slain. So the Assyrians, who were used to or accustomed to mistreating other people, are now the ones who are going to suffer. Other comments on verse 2 and read the first part of verse 3. All right, how does it describe the dead? The last part of verse 3 talks about the number of people who die. Question number 4. How's it described in verse 3? Velma.
The multitudes that are slain, and it calls a great number of carcasses and no end of corpses that you'd stumble on if you walked in the city.
Okay, so many corpses that the soldiers are stumbling over them as they walk about through the city, stumbling over the corpses. Okay, terrible, terrible scene of vicious suffering, which the Assyrians had done to other nations. Now it's happening to them. Other comments to verse 3? Questions? Okay. Now then, verse 4, he uses a somewhat different illustration to describe, again, the reason why Assyria or Nineveh needed to fall. What's the illustration in verse 4? What does he compare it to in verse 4? Nineveh is like what?
Sorceries.
Okay, sorceries, there's mistress of sorceries. Okay, not just there are sorceries, but she specializes in it. What else? Frank?
Countless whorings, prostitution.
Okay, so he compares her to a harlot, a multitude of harlotries, seductive harlot, okay? And selling nations through her harlotries and families through her sorcery. So she's seducing others. Again, going back to the lies and the robbery, she professes to be attractive, but she's really using it for her own benefit. And in the end, she will destroy those who she seduces. Okay? So not only is she full of lies and robbery and bloody violence, she's seductive, like a harlot, seducing with her appeal to those who are around her. Okay, other nation questions, comments through verse 4. Anybody? Okay? So now verse 5. What does God say he's going to do as a result in verse 5? To some extent, he's continuing the illustration of the harlot. What does he say he's going to do in verse 5? This is question number 6. Sharon.
He's going to embarrass them, like having a woman having her skirt lifted up. They were so great, people would think that they were amazing and fantastic, but when God defeats them, everyone will see the truth and how horrible they were.
Okay. Other comments on verse 5? Okay, so for a woman to show her nakedness would be shameful. And but God is going to shame her. Show the kingdoms your shame, he says. In the last part of verse 5. And it's interesting, a comment, again, that I read was that to be publicly unclothed was considered a humiliating condition in the ancient Near East. Assyrian sculptures often depicted naked prisoners soon to be killed. So to be naked was a shame. And it's an interesting thing that even these heathen pagans knew that, and yet you wonder about some people in our society. Do they understand the shame? What it's like when they don't cover themselves like they should? These people knew it, and God was going to do it too. Of course, it's simple. Shame Assyria in that by using that illustration. Okay, other comments, verse 5. Okay, questions, verse 6. What else is he going to do? Not only lifting her skirts to show her nakedness, but what else? Verse 6. Question number 8. What else is he going to do? Karen.
Make them vile and a spectacle.
All right, they're going to be a spectacle. Okay? And he's going to cast filth upon her. Okay, so not only nakedness, but then filth thrown upon her to shame her and embarrass her. Okay? Anything else to verse 6? Again, obviously, this, of course, is symbolic. Simply God's way of describing that he's going to cause her downfall and her shame. Okay? How will this affect the people who know about it? In verse 7. Oh, Rick?
They're going to flee from her, and they're not going to bemoan her.
Okay, they'll flee from her. And why would they not bemoan her? He doesn't come right out and say, but why do you suppose that people are not going to be? You'd think that the downfall of a great nation would be a cause of sorrow, but in this case, people aren't going to be sorry to see her fall. Why?
Well, back a verse or two, it says God's going to expose her sins to the other nations, so they will see how abominable it was, and any decent person would not want that to happen to them either.
Okay, because she was so corrupt, so evil. Terry?
When we look back at the story of Jonah, we see Jonah's reaction to the fact that God might spare this city. And they were so wicked that Jonah just could not understand how could you spare these people. And of course they repented, but that shows the attitude of others around them. They knew what they've done to everybody, no matter who they took over. They did terrible things to them.
Okay, when someone's so totally corrupt and evil, mistreating other people around them falls, why would the people around be sad to see them fall? They've been suffering at her mistreatment and the violence that she did. So in many cases, they're glad. And when an evil ruler falls, the people who are suffering because of him are glad. And that seems to me to be the idea here. They're not going to comfort her. They're not going to bemoan her. They're glad to see the downfall of such a wicked and corrupt city and nation. Okay? Other comments through verse 7. Okay, let's read some more then. Let's read, how about 8 through 13? If you'd like to read verses 8 through 13 for us, please. Verse 8 through 13. If you'd like to read it for us, please. Danny, please.
Are you better than Nahum, which was situated by the waters of the Nile, with water surrounding her, whose ramparts was the sea, whose wall consisted of the sea? Ethiopia was her might, and Egypt too without limits. Put and Nahum were among her helpers, yet she became an exile. She went into captivity. And her small children were dashed to pieces at the head of every street. They cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound with fetters. You too will become drunk. You will be hidden. You too will search for refuge from the enemy. All your fortifications are fig trees with ripe fruit. When shaken, they fall into the eater's mouth. Behold, your people are women in your midst. The gates of your land are opened wide to your enemies. Fire consumes your gate bars.
Okay, so he continues to describe the city, but he compares it to the fall of another city in verse 8. And who is that? Who does he compare it to? Frank?
Nahum, or the city of Hammon, down on the river of Nile. Another name was Thebes. It was another great city surrounded by water and was overtaken.
Okay, so you have this a city. I pronounce it Nahum, and I'm not sure what the right pronunciation is, but it was Thebes. It was just another name for it in Egypt. And he's describing the fall of that city. Why would Assyria know about the fall of Thebes or Nahum? Why would they know about that? Sharon?
Because their king Ashurbanipal had recently destroyed it in 663.
Okay, Assyria were the ones who caused the downfall. So here was another city which was seemingly impregnable, that nobody could be able to defeat it or cause it to fall, surrounded by waters, the sea, the river, that is the Nile River. And not only was it well defended by the situation, verse 9, what else would have contributed to make it difficult for her to fall? What other advantage did it have besides her situation? What else in verse 9 would make it difficult to defeat it?
By the sea. She had the sea on one side of her.
Okay. What else, Karen?
Ethiopia and Egypt had said that they would help.
All right, so she had allies. Ethiopia was to the south of it, Egypt to the north. Thebes is located like about 450 miles south of Cairo. At one time it was a capital city of Egypt. So she had her allies. And mentions also Lubim, which is also Libya. I don't know where Put is. I'm not familiar with that one. But she had all these helping her. And so she would have thought that nobody could possibly defeat her. Okay? Nevertheless, what happened in verse 10? Despite her strength and apparent safety, security, what happened? verse 10.
They were still defeated.
Okay, carried away, it says. Went into captivity. Okay? How does it describe her fall in last part of verse 10? She's defeated. What things happen? Terry?
Even her great men were bound in chains, and her honored men, they cast lots for or sold as slaves or something like that.
Okay, so everyone was defeated, was not just the young children, but even the greatest of the men were defeated, bound in chains, and so on. So it was a complete defeat at the hands of the Assyrians. So they knew about this. So what's the point? What is the message or the lesson that Nahum is wanting Nineveh to learn from this, from the fall of Nahum or Thebes? What's the application, Karen?
He's told them over and over again, because of their great sins, are going to be destroyed, and there is no rescue.
Okay, so if this great city could fall, you can fall. Don't think just because you have a secure situation and great armies to defend you, but don't think that means that I can't bring you down. You brought down Thebes, and I can bring you down. You will suffer just as surely as they did. Okay, other comments? Okay, and once again, we have historical support for this event. Again, from the Assyrians themselves. They knew what happened. So here you have a record on Ashurbanipal's first campaign against Egypt. He took 22 kings from the seacoast with their armies to help fight the Egyptians. Ashurbanipal claims that he made those kings with their forces and their ships accompany me by sea and by land. One of the kings was Manasseh, I don't know if that's Manasseh, king of Judah with his army. On his second campaign in 663 BC, Ashurbanipal went to Nahum and defeated the city and razed it. There were Judeans in the Assyrian army that saw this event. When they heard or read the words of Nahum, they would have been encouraged. The Assyrians were able to defeat a strong and impregnable Thebes. God would now fulfill his word, and Nineveh would fall. Ashurbanipal commissioned a relief depicting the fall of Nahum. The top of the relief has the Assyrians besieging the city with the ladders, soldiers undermining the walls, and the soldier torching the gate. So not only is this confirmed by archaeology, it shows that the Assyrians knew about it because they did it, and the people of Judah knew about it because many of them had been compelled by the Assyrians to be involved in the battle. Okay? So everybody knew about the fall of this city. In the same way, God could make sure that Nineveh would fall. So in verse 11, you also will be drunk. You will be hidden, and you will seek refuge from the enemy. Okay? Other comments on the fall of Thebes or Nahum? Okay. What about the description in verse 11? He says you'll be drunk and you'll be hidden. Comments on that? What conclusion does that lead us to? Terry?
Well, they would try to hide instead of going forth to battle as they were used to. They were going to feel the need to hide, but there would be no hiding from this, and they'd seek help and refuge, but none would come.
Okay, no way to help. No matter what preparations they made, she was going to be destroyed. Okay, other comments through verse 11. More illustration then in verse 12. What does he compare it to the fall in verse 12? Question number 17 we're on now. How does he illustrate the fall of it in verse 12, Rick?
Like fig trees with ripe fruit on them.
Okay, so when the fruit was ripe on the fig tree, how would the people bring the fruit down? Rick?
They just shake the tree.
All right, shake the tree and the fruit would fall off. And it just says like they're falling into your open mouth. Okay, so you're ready for it and it just falls. Okay, so what's the point of the illustration? as regards Nineveh. Neil?
It's going to be easy for so I take it as it's going to be easy for the opposing force to overtake them. It's not going to.
Okay, so you're ripe to fall too. When the time comes that it falls off easily, your time has come too. You're ripe for destruction. Just like the figs, when they come, there won't be anything to prevent it. You're going to fall too, just like those figs when the tree is shaken. Okay? Other comments to verse 12. Terry.
I think that helps us when we look at difficulties that we, might question why hasn't something happened? Why hasn't this been dealt with? Why hasn't God done something about this? It helps us to look back at things like this and recognize God has a time, and He will do it in His time because He knows when the right time is for that to happen.
All right, that's a good point, good illustration. And you look at our own nation and other wicked nations around us, and we think, well, they really need to be destroyed. They need to be punished. God should do something. He will when they're ripe. When they reach the point that He's convinced, all right, this is the time, He'll take steps, He'll take action. But just because they haven't fallen doesn't mean God thinks they're okay. It just means the time hasn't come yet when they're ripe. Okay? And we've discussed that with other nations, haven't we, in our studies of the prophets and the Old Testament. Okay? Other comments on verse number 12? Anybody? Velma.
Well, also when God was going to give the children the land that they were to inherit, it was not done until the fullness of time with the wickedness in those people.
Okay, it's exactly what God said, wasn't it? That the people of Israel would capture the land of Canaan when the iniquity of the Amorites was full. That the right time had to come. They were wicked, but God would bring Israel into the land when the nations were wicked enough that God had determined for them to fall. Okay? Terry?
I think we also need to think about ourselves. Sometimes we may feel like, well, nothing is going against me, so I must be all right. But that doesn't mean that. We just may not have gotten ripe enough yet in our wickedness that God is going to do something with us. And so that can't be our form of judgment about how God looks at us.
That's a good point. That it's easy for us to, and other scriptures make that point. We look at whether it's ourselves or other people. People seem to be prospering, and yet they're wicked. And a lot of people say, well, they must not be too bad, or God would do something about it. Why are they prospering? And they must not be that bad, or that's what they may think. Must be, I'm okay with God, or here I am prospering. So the point is that's not so. The time hasn't come yet. And in particular, for individuals, the time will come, if not in this life, then after this life. But the time will come when God will see to it that we'll be punished. Okay? Other comments through verse 12. All right, verse 13. He describes the fall, continues to fall, describe the fall. Why do they fall? How does he describe the fact that they are no longer able to defend the city? In verse 13. They can't defend it. Why? Rick.
They haven't got any strength left in them. Their people are like women. And so the military force or their might wasn't there. And the gates of their land were left wide open for anybody to come in.
Okay, so the rather than being strong like they thought they were, and like they had been in the past in capturing other nations, they no longer have that strength. He describes them as they're being like women. And the gates are wide open to the enemies. That is, there's may not be physically open, but they're not going to be able to protect the city anymore. Fire will devour the bars of your gates. So whereas they had been strong and thought that they could be secure, it's no longer the case. God's going to see to it that the enemy can come right in and defeat them. Other comments to verse 13. Terry?
It also implies the attitude that the gates were wide open, implies the attitude that we have nothing to fear. They weren't afraid of other people. They felt like they had nothing to fear, but they were not taking into account God. And they had their gods and that they trusted in, and here is the God that will rule over them, who's saying you're coming to an end.
Okay, and I think in particular the idea is God's going to make sure the gates are open. With God, no protection that you seek is going to succeed. Okay? Okay, and I also ask you a question regarding the idea that the people in your midst are women. We've got a place in our society now where sometimes people think that women should be in combat, that they should be the ones to protect a nation. And yet we have here an example, it seems to me, to show that that's not their place. That's not the kind of position that women should be put in. When they are, that a nation has reached the point that it's weak, no longer defensible. I think people should think about that when they talk about women being put in combat. Other comments through verse 13? Anybody? All right, let's read some more then. Let's read 14 through 17. Who'd like to read 14 through 17 for us, please? Chapter 3, verse 14 through 17. Tim, please.
Draw your water for the siege, fortify your strongholds, go into the clay and tread the mortar. Make strong the brick kiln. Fire will devour you, the sword will cut you off. I will eat you like a locust. Make yourself many like the locust. Make yourself many like the swarming locust. You have multiplied your merchants more than the stars of heaven. The locust plunder and flies away. Your commanders are like swarming locusts, and your generals like great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges on a cold day. When the sun rises, they flee away, and the place where they are is not known.
All right. So verse 14 describes what? What she's describing is what she's saying about it in verse 14, question number 20. Sharon.
Same thing as at the beginning of chapter 2. They should get ready and be prepared to defend themselves, but it isn't going to do any good anyway.
All right, so he'd already described it in chapter 2, hadn't he? Get ready. Draw water, that is, have plenty of water so that you have plenty to drink when you're besieged by this other nation. Fortify the strongholds. Get ready. What's the idea of going to the clay and tread the mortar? Make strong the brick kiln. What's the idea of that? Terry?
The idea of building your walls up, making yourself secure.
Okay, so plenty of brick to build up your walls, make them strong. If there's any effort to tear them down, you have the means to build them up again. No matter what they do, you think you're ready. So get ready, but as Sharon said, it's not going to do you any good. God's going to make sure that she's going to fall. Okay? Other comments on verse 14? All right, so there's no protection when the time comes. What will happen in the end then, verse 15? Rather than being strong and protected, what will happen? Rick?
Just like back up in verse 13, it says, fire will devour the bars of your gates. Down here, fire will devour you, the sword will cut you off.
Okay? The fire will destroy you, fire will cut you off, no protection. Now the end of verse 15, he begins to use an illustration of a locust. And so, what's the illustration in the middle of verse 15 of the locust? What's his point? Rick?
When locusts attack in swarms, they eat up everything in their path. They destroy everything in their path. That's what it's going to do here. They're going to eat you up like a locust would.
Okay. Other comments? So who is the locust in this passage? The locust are who? Frank?
The Medes and the Babylonians.
Okay, that's what okay, that's one view. Actually, to me, it seemed the other way. I said, make yourself many, which would be the people of Nineveh. So that's what I took it to mean. That just like he said, draw water and fortify your strongholds and build your bricks and so on, there may be many of you, like locusts, but you're still going to fall. That's what I took it, because he says make yourself many, like the locust, and make yourself many, like the swarming locust. That's what I took it to mean, but I admit it's difficult, and sometimes there's even questions of translation in this section. Other comments? Okay, so even though they prepared, and there were many of them, they were still going to fall. Okay? How about verse 16? Who else does he describe as being many in verse 16? Karen?
Many multiples of merchants, more than the stars of heaven.
All right, so not only had they many people and soldiers and so on, they had many merchants. So what would this have to do with it? Why is he talking about the merchants of Nineveh or Assyria? Debbie?
It was a big commerce city. They had a lot of goods, and they sold and bought freely.
Okay, so they had many merchants and took advantage of other nations. It was like a city known for its commerce, but they plundered other nations with their merchants. They weren't really benefiting other nations. They were plundering other nations with their merchants. And again, there's some questions maybe of translation here, but that's what it seems to me to be saying. Other comments on verse 16? All right, so make yourself many like locusts. Your merchants are multiplied like locusts. And what else is multiplied in verse 17? What else multiplies? Verse 17. Karen?
They're commanders and generals.
All right, they're leaders. They have many leaders. It's like swarming locusts, like great grasshoppers. But what happens to these grasshoppers? In the last part of it, you've got lots of military leaders, you've got lots of commanders and lots of generals, but what's going to happen to them? In the last part of verse 17.
Flee away.
They're going to flee away. Okay, and again, I can see some other viewpoints, but the idea seems to be that they said on a cold day they're in the hedges, but when the sun rises they flee away. So it seems to me the idea is that the locusts at night they rest. When it's cool, they don't fly, they don't do much. They just because of the cool weather. But as soon as it gets warm, then they fly. Well, that's what's going to happen to their commanders, their generals. They can be around until the battle comes, and then they're not going to be able to find them. The last part of verse 17, the place where they are is not known. They run away. They fled. They're not there to defend the city like they should have. Again, that's what it seems to me to be saying. Questions, comments through verse 17? Anybody? Okay, Belma.
Back in 16.
16?
Yes, does anyone else have a reference to the word merchants as the King James puts it as hired soldiers, mercenaries? Not commerce, but the hiring of others to help.
Okay, so read verse 16 in the King James then, Belma.
Thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven. But the reference over in my sideline says, or thy hired soldiers.
Okay, so that's a footnote, you're saying. Okay? Okay. So.
And it could apply because they did try to get others to help.
Okay, so the King James has a footnote implying that it isn't the merchants that were multiplied, but we would say mercenary soldiers, that they hired other soldiers to multiply. Okay? All right, any other comments on that? Debbie?
And that makes sense if their leadership runs away because they don't want to lead that kind of an army.
Okay. Other comments? All right, well, I hadn't seen that, but that's an interesting point. Okay? Anything else to verse 17? Sharon?
When it says when the sun rises, they flee away, I agree that's the commanders and the leaders and so on. When it says the place where they are is not known, is that the same as the leaders fleeing away, or is that referring to Nineveh itself disappearing so completely that we didn't know where it was for a long time?
Comments? Is it the leaders who are not known, or this location of Nineveh itself is no longer known? Comments? Obviously, good, Terry?
The English Standard leaves you with the thought that it's the leaders that are not known where they are. It says, what's this line?
Last part of 17.
Okay, your scribes like the clouds of the locusts setting on the fences in a cold day. When the sun rises, they fly away, and no one knows where they are.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like to me. It's they fly away. Nobody knows where they are. That's what it sounds like. But it's true, nevertheless. It's true that the location of the city is not known today. Okay? Other comments through 17. Okay, let's read the last couple of verses then. We'd like to read 18 and 19 for us, please. Neil, please.
Your shepherds are sleeping, O king of Assyria. Your devils are lying down. Your people are scattered on the mountain, and there is no one to regather them. There is no relief for your breakdown. Your wound is incurable. All who hear about you will clap their hands over you. For on whom has not yet your evil passed continually?
Okay? So as we conclude the chapter, what is he saying about well, first of all, the shepherds. What does he say about the shepherds in verse 18? So he talked about the generals and the commanders and so on, but now he talks about the shepherds. So who would the shepherds be in verse 18?
Government leaders.
All right, the leaders, probably. That's who shepherds are, or spiritual leaders in other passages. The leaders, just like the shepherds lead the sheep. So these leaders are responsible to lead the nation. But what are they doing? Instead of leading the nation, what are they doing?
Scattering the people.
All right, scattered.
It says they're sleeping.
All right, they're sleeping. Rick, what were we going to say?
According to the verses before, they're fleeing.
Okay, so the leaders and the generals and so on are fleeing. In verse 17, verse 18, the shepherds are sleeping. They're resting in the dust. That is, either that they're asleep or they're dead, whichever. And the people are scattered, and no one gathers them. All right, so now they're without leaders. You see, the generals and the commanders have fled away. The shepherds, the nobles are asleep. They're not involved in, so the people, they don't have leadership, which means they're going to fall. Comments on 18? Okay, and that's what happens to a nation when it becomes corrupt. It has corrupt leaders. It has leaders who don't know what they're doing. They're not involved. Many times they're involved in their own personal luxury and pleasures rather than paying attention to the good of the country. They're involved in the things that please them and living lives of luxury. And so the result is that people don't have the leadership they need, and they're scattered and not gathered. Verse 18. Okay? Other comments? And the end result, verse 19. What's the final outcome, the final result to the nation? Verse 19. Karen?
Their injury is severe, there's no healing. It's a death sentence.
All right, it's a death sentence. There's no healing. It's a fatal wound. The wound is severe. But how do people react to that? The question, last part of verse 19, how do people react?
You rejoice. Clap your hands.
All right, they're rejoicing. They hear noise, they clap with their hands. Why? The last part of verse 19, why would the people be happy at the fall of the nation? Frank?
Because of the wicked way that they had treated the nations around them.
Okay, so all the nations around them know of the wickedness, and they've suffered at the hands of the Assyrians. So when the nation falls, they're not sorry for the fall of the nation. They're glad to see the evil influence and the harmful treatment to pass away. Okay, so when all these things are going to happen to Assyria, but other people aren't going to be sorry to hear it, they're going to be glad because it's the end of the mistreatment and the violence, the bloody mistreatment that they've been receiving at the hands of Assyria. Okay? Other comments through verse 19. All right, so we've seen now the downfall of Assyria, which was the main point of the prophecy of Nahum. So we reach the end of the book. What are some things we learned from the book? What are some applications, some lessons that we can learn from this description of the fall of Nineveh and Assyria? Rick?
Hey, you look back at the whole book, and it's the same. You can believe in all your false gods you want. You can believe in sorcery. You can believe in all kinds of other power, but there's only one true God and one true power that controls everything.
Okay, so it's certainly an indictment of idolatry, isn't it? That the Assyrians, they trusted in their false gods, they trusted in their occult powers, but none of those have power against the true God. The true God is the God of all, every place and every people, wherever they may be. All right, that's certainly a major lesson, isn't it? Other lessons that we can learn from the book of Nahum. Terry?
It expresses God's feeling about how we treat our fellow man. And the idea that goes with that for me is we were made in God's image. What we do to our fellow man, we do to God. And he will not stand for that.
Okay, and so we have the how we treat other people matters to God, and he's going to punish us if we don't treat. And we've seen that again and again in the prophets, haven't we? That the mistreatment of others is something that God will not tolerate, and he expects people to treat one another with respect. Other comments? Anything else you learned in the book of Nahum? Karen?
It doesn't make any difference what nation it is, and that applies today. When a nation becomes very, very wicked, then God is no longer their God, and he won't be with them.
So evil nations are going to fall in God's time. When they're ripe, when God determines the time has come, the nation's going to fall. And the only thing that can keep it from falling is righteousness, turning away from evil, and practicing what's good and right and pleasing to God. And that's why God's warning these nations. That's the point. That's what Jonah did with Nineveh, and the nation stood for a good while afterwards, but eventually it's going to fall if the corruption continues. Other lessons from the book of Nahum, anybody? All right, well, thank you for your participation, and next time then we'll have assignments and look into the book of Habakkuk. Okay, thank you.